Hi again. I'm just gonna kind of continue on from where I left off. So right now I'm gonna talk about something called the Pavilion of Realism. So this is kind of the stepping stone to alternative exhibitions that weren't just the Salon in France. Going back, I was talking about the concept of realism, and Courbet also had a lot to do with the Pavilion of Realism. So Courbet wanted to exhibit his work in the Salon in 1855. But of course they didn't want to exhibit his work because they thought it kind of looked grubby looking, and it also didn't really have a good subject matter in terms of not having any heroism to it or any kind of dramaticness. So he was kind of pissed, of course, and so he decided to have his own exhibition due to his desire to promote himself, because that was another thing that salons did. They were great for promoting artists. Like, instead of getting commissions at this point, like, there was exhibitions where people could go to and, buy their works. It was really good business for them. So outside the salon, he set up a huge tent that said the Pavilion of Realism. So, imagine if there was only one exhibition a year and it was very controlled by the state and all the students competed to be in it. And if you were rejected, you might as well kind of give up as an artist. It was kind of like, all or nothing sort of aspect. But Courbet attacked this concept, and it really provided a different way of thinking, which led to Impressionism, I believe, as well. Okay, so the next one I'm going to talk about is a little bit lengthy, and it's more of a concept that you need to know in order to understand a lot of paintings, especially in terms of Impressionism, and with Van Gogh's paintings, and with Cézanne, just a lot of those well-known Impressionists and Post-Impressionists, like Manet and stuff. And it's, excuse me. Okay, it's called the Japanese aesthetic. So it's another important aspect of modern life, and the introduction of Japanese prints was very important in that concept. So, kind of a history lesson. Before the 1850s, Japan was a very secluded country, and it was only until the mid-1850s, with Commodore Perry, that they opened their ports to public trade. Everything that was Japanese became very popular in the West, and it's a term known as Japonese, and I'll write that down as well, because it's a French word too. It's not very hard to remember, but and this also kind of relates to the term of exoticism, because they thought this was very exotic. So prints, porcelain, fashion, etc. And kind of a side note, actually, a lot of just Asian or Oriental, I hate using that term Oriental, works in general are very confused with either them being Chinese or Japanese. So, for example, if you had a Chinese fan, it'd be Japanese. Or if you had a Japanese print, it'd be like, oh, this is Chinese. Or something like that. What I'm trying to say is it was very generalized, and that's kind of what the problem of exoticism was. It was very generalized because to them, everything, it was the same, almost. Anyways, the Japanese prints were so amazing because the pictorial space was so different compared to how Western artists approach pictorial space. So it broke with what they understood, how an artist was supposed to see the world. So, example, if you look at Hiroshige's plum tree, which Van Gogh replicated, you notice that there's a lack of linear perspective, or the Renaissance window. So you know how Western artists begin to see their frame as a window to look through. That's kind of what a Renaissance window was. However, once they saw this, they realized that this wasn't the only way to see the world. But before, they thought that this was an actual way of seeing it, and it was simply a fabrication. And I think that's what we need to understand, is the concept of the Renaissance window and linear perspective was very fabricated and very made up. It's not, real. It's just an optical illusion, so to speak. So, what exactly about this Japanese model made it so different? So, other than the lack of linear perspective in the Renaissance window? Well, instead of looking through a picture, you also looked at a picture. So you look at a Japanese print and you can see depth in it, but you also understand that it's a flat surface as well. So For example, like flat colors kind of emphasize that, or that gradient in the plum tree one, or what I call the Japanese tree. You see this a lot in post-impression works, and especially Cezanne's work with the Japanese tree. So, or just an object in general. So an object could be so close to the foreground towards the viewer that it almost looks abstract in a way because it's cropped in a very interesting manner. And that's another characteristic of the Japanese aesthetic. And so while they're calling attention to the depth, they're simultaneously also calling attention to the flatness. And that's what makes these prints so interesting. It's not trying to make something up, but it's also kind of like, I always think of that picture of the old lady and the young woman, how we can see both and alternate. That's kind of what the Japanese aesthetic was all about, too. Okay, so the term facture is the quality of a paint on a surface, or it's kind of paying attention to the surface of the canvas, as Professor Saylor, I believe, said. So you see this a lot with Monet's work, Impressionism work, just the quality of the surface and how it's painted was suddenly becoming a huge focus during this time. Kind of in between Romanticism and Impressionism, kind of this experimentation stage. Okay, so I did mention before about the Salon de Refuse, and I was going to mention that. And so what the Salon de Refuse is, it's literally the Salon of the Rejected. So Manet, M-A-N-E-T, for example, had trouble getting into the salons as well, especially with his scandalous pieces. Not only the subject matter, but the way it was painted was very scandalous, so think of Olympia in that sense. And even though he was rejected, he continued to try. But it wasn't just him that was getting rejected. It was a lot of other artists that were beginning to get rejected because they were trying new things that weren't part of the academic, that weren't part of neoclassicism. So in 1863, the Salon mounted a counter-exhibition known as the Salon de Refuse. Those people who didn't get into the Salon got into this other one. And like I mentioned before, the academic arts were usually related to neoclassicism, or that type of genre of art. So what was kind of negative about that is a lot of people were thinking this was very boring. So a lot of people came to the Salon de Refuse because while it was kind of scandalous and not quote-unquote official, it was incredibly exciting. And so, you know, I kind of liked how Dr. Saylor mentioned it, where she was like, where the academic artists would be like, oh, you know, there's those crazy young artists doing whatever they want, doing different things, and yeah, don't go there. But everyone went anyways, so I thought that was really cool. And again, just like the Pavilion of Realism, it was an alternative exhibition concept, and then at this point it was becoming a lot more common now, and it was becoming a lot easier for other artists who were approaching art in a different way to exhibit their work and promote themselves. Okay. So, I'm sure you guys know what Impressionism is, but I'm just going to recap. Impressionism came really in the 1870s, and so by then, Manet's scandalous paintings were in the 1860s. So, it was literally a decade later, and artists weren't even trying to get into the salon anymore at this point. They were beginning to think about having their own exhibitions, actually. And so a group of artists decided to start their own exhibition. So they rented out like a storefront, a building, and had their own shows. And these artists were eventually known as the Impressions, as a critic named them, and he actually named them in a very negative way, but they just kind of kept the name. Okay, so en plein, this is kind of just a concept for artists to go outside and paint quickly, such as painting in the field, and Monet's Sunrise is very well known for that. So, for example, he would actually use the en plein air concept to make that a finalized piece. So what I'm trying to say is, beforehand, there were artists who did that. There were artists who went outside and sketched, but that's exactly what they were. They were sketches. They weren't studio artists who were painting a scene, and then after they were done, it was like, this is finished. It was a weird concept at the time. It's a weird thing to think about at the time. So I did mention Avant Garde as well, and this is also an important concept. especially in modern art. So along with modern life and its change, art begins to strive and change as well at this point, as you can see with the Salon de Refuse, the Pavilion of Realism, Impressionism. So Avant Garde are those artists who are breaking the academic art rules and quote-unquote blazing the trail. So it's just those artists who are going against those set of rules, a hierarchy of genre, and doing their own thing, experimenting with art, the painting and what it can do. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Post-Impressionism, or the Impressionists that came later. So if we think about Monet, and that's M-O-N-E-T, as the quintessential example of Impressionism, there's almost no artist that fits that idea. So what Impressionism proper was kind of that, and it started to fade away really quickly. And it was because by the late 1800s, artists were getting tired of that approach. And what I mean by that approach is there was no content in the painting. And it was kind of a very optical kind of art. It was just painting for the sake of experimentation, I feel like. Just experimenting with, just the way paint works. There was no content about it. I mean, as the viewer, I believe we can find content in the way he was painting, or like Monet's sunrise. I feel like as viewers we can see that. For example, we can see that Facture was a content, but the artist wasn't trying to imbue meaning or have us think about something deeper. And I think that was a huge issue, and that's what a lot of artists got tired of this. And they actually thought it was kind of shallow. So a lot of artists in the 1880s thought that art needed to have more content, so they started to look for it. So there were some artists who looked for content in abstract art. So content creating by focusing on the medium and the technique. But there's also other artists who thought meaning should be created through more traditional means, such as iconography or symbolic use of color. So at the time, it wasn't called Post-Impressionism. It was still known as Impressionism. And it was actually only 30 years later, in the 20th century, that an art historian saw that these artists were different from Impressionists because of that idea of content. So it was actually that art historian who called them Post-Impressionists. I don't believe this is a term you really need to know, but it is something that's important, especially because I know that a lot of you guys have, if you guys have taken color theory or 2D, I believe color theory, you've done this before. Kaibo made kind of an invention of a type of painting application called Paintalism, and it's literally just painting in tiny little dots. And then going back with Gauguin, I know I'm going way later into our later works, but he